He assumed she didn't live here and demanded to leave the pool. He didn't know who was in front of him. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching the video from. The sun had barely begun its slow ascent over the Los Angeles hills when Ronda Rousey stood barefoot in her kitchen, staring at nothing in particular. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the quiet, modern space, the morning light spilling across the marble countertops like a patient river. She had woken before dawn out of habit, muscle memory from years of early training sessions, press calls, and the relentless pace of a life built on expectation. But today was supposed to be different. Today, she had nothing to do, and the unfamiliar weight of that freedom pressed against her shoulders like an anchor. It had been months since Ronda had experienced anything resembling peace. Between the filming schedules, interviews, meetings, and the constant, exhausting demand of public attention, her days had blurred into one long, unbroken stretch of obligation. Even when she wasn't standing under bright lights, she carried the posture of someone bracing for impact. Fame, she had long ago realized, was not a reward but a contract. A trade of privacy for applause, vulnerability for a seat at the table. And lately, she wasn't sure the deal had been worth it. The house was new. She'd purchased it quietly, without fanfare, in an upscale gated community tucked into the folds of the hills. It wasn't extravagant by celebrity standards. Ronda had no taste for towering ceilings or chandeliers, but it was clean, bright, and private. That was the point. Privacy. A place where no one cared who she had been in the octagon or how many headlines her name could generate. A place where, maybe, she could just be. But even here, the silence felt like something borrowed, something she'd have to give back. Ronda poured herself a glass of water, leaning against the counter as she sipped, her eyes drifting toward the backyard where the first slant of sunlight touched the patio furniture. She could already feel the heat pressing at the edges of the day, the promise of another blistering Southern California afternoon. Normally, she would have retreated to the home gym or slipped out before anyone else woke, blending into the anonymity of a sunrise run, but her body felt heavy, her mind heavier. She didn't want to run. She didn't want to sweat or fight or prepare for anything. She wanted to breathe. The thought of the community pool had crossed her mind the night before, an idle suggestion that she hadn't taken seriously. She almost laughed at herself when it surfaced again. The pool. She couldn't remember the last time she'd willingly sat near strangers in the daylight. No cameras, no purpose. But the more she turned the idea over in her mind, the more it felt like something she could do. Not because she needed to, but because no one would expect it. That was what she craved now, a day without expectations. She set the empty glass in the sink and walked toward her bedroom, moving with the deliberate ease of someone who had spent years listening to the language of her own body. She selected a pair of loose navy shorts and a simple tank top, sliding her arms through the soft fabric as if she were putting on armor. Her tattoos peeked out from beneath the thin cotton, the inked stories of battles fought and won, visible to anyone who cared to look. She tucked her hair beneath a baseball cap, slipping on a pair of plain sandals. No makeup, no jewelry, no phone, no shield. By the time she stepped outside, the neighborhood was beginning to stir. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across manicured lawns, and the faint sound of a lawnmower buzzed in the distance. Ronda walked slowly, letting the morning air settle around her, the quiet rustle of palm leaves overhead mingling with the occasional bark of a dog or the rumble of a passing car. The community itself felt curated, a picture-perfect slice of suburban California living. The streets curved gently between rows of near-identical houses, each one immaculately maintained, with fresh paint and strategically planted greenery. It was the kind of neighborhood designed to look effortless, though Rhonda knew better. Nothing effortless stayed that pristine. The pool wasn't far, just a few blocks down, past a small playground and the clubhouse that doubled as a meeting space for the homeowners association. She walked the familiar path slowly, hands tucked into her pockets, her eyes tracing the cracks in the pavement, the cheerful pastel chalk drawings left behind by children the night before. As she approached the black iron gate, she could already hear the soft chatter of voices, the splashing of water punctuated by the shrill laughter of kids. The scent of chlorine hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of jasmine that crawled along the fence line. She paused at the entrance, her fingers brushing over the small key fob clipped to her waistband before she pushed the gate open. The space inside was exactly what she had expected. A rectangular pool glimmering under the morning sun, surrounded by a concrete deck and clusters of lounge chairs. A few families were scattered around the perimeter, young parents corralling toddlers, an older couple flipping through magazines, a handful of teenagers sprawled out with headphones and phones in hand. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and that, more than anything, made it inviting. Rhonda selected a chair near the far end of the pool, away from the clusters of conversation. She laid her towel down, slid off her sandals, and sat back, her gaze drifting towards the clear blue surface of the water. For a few minutes, she let her breathing slow, the tension in her shoulders easing under the quiet rhythm of splashes and voices. It wasn't peace, not really, but it was close. As the minutes passed, she became aware of how unfamiliar the sensation was. Being in a public space without performance, without the weight of expectation. Here, no one seemed to recognize her. She was just another woman in a baseball cap, sitting quietly, taking up space without explanation. It felt fragile, like something that could disappear the moment someone looked too closely. Still, she let herself settle into it, closing her eyes behind her sunglasses, the sunlight warm against her skin. She thought about nothing. She thought about everything. She let the noise around her blur into a background hum. Somewhere, distantly, a child shrieked with laughter. Someone's phone rang and was quickly silenced. A breeze rustled the leaves overhead. For the first time in months, Rhonda felt herself begin to relax. It didn't last. She didn't notice him at first, not until the rhythm of the space shifted, the sound of footsteps approaching, deliberate and too focused like a weight pressing into the air. She opened her eyes without moving, catching the shape of a man in khaki shorts and a collared shirt, his stance stiff, purposeful. He wasn't wet. He wasn't holding a towel. He wasn't here to swim. He was watching her. For a heartbeat, she tried to ignore it, to let the moment pass. She'd spent years learning when to engage and when to let things slide. But there was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he stood too still, too close, that made her stomach tighten. He lingered longer than necessary, his gaze sharp and assessing. She could feel it like a weight on her skin. And then he started walking toward her. Rhonda sat up slowly, sliding her sunglasses to the top of her cap as she met his eyes. She didn't say anything, not yet. She didn't need to. She already knew exactly how this conversation would go. She'd heard it before, in airports, in grocery stores, in too many spaces where people assumed they had the right to question her presence. And here, in the place she had chosen specifically to be invisible, it was happening again. The silence she had fought so hard to find was already beginning to unravel. The shift in the air was subtle at first, the kind of atmospheric change that didn't immediately register but quietly unsettled. Ronda felt it before she saw him, an uninvited presence, something that disturbed the fragile balance she had carved out for herself in that moment of calm. When she looked up fully, she found him standing just beyond the boundary of what most would consider polite distance. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, light-skinned, with neatly combed sandy hair and a rigid posture that spoke less of casual relaxation and more of someone who had designated himself the sheriff of this small, chlorinated world. His collared polo shirt was crisp despite the heat, tucked into khaki shorts that were pulled up just a bit too high. There was no towel slung over his shoulder, no book in his hand, no child or spouse nearby. He was not here to enjoy the morning. He was here on patrol. He was watching her with the kind of intent that felt clinical, cold, and judgmental all at once. Not curious, not friendly, assessing. Ronda met his gaze without a word, her posture unmoved. She had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to lose ground was to react first. She let him stand there, let him look, let him make the choice to approach, to cross the line he already hovered over. When he finally stepped closer, his smile was tight, practiced, the kind that never reached the eyes. It wasn't hospitality. It was performative civility stretched over something brittle and hard. "Morning," he said, voice clipped. "You new around here?" Ronda tilted her head slightly, her expression giving nothing away. She answered evenly. "No." The man's smile thinned further. His gaze flicked over her, the cap, the tank top, the tattoos visible on her arms, the lack of jewelry or makeup, the bare simplicity of her presence, and whatever calculation was running in his head clicked forward a notch. He nodded once, then crossed his arms, a posture she recognized immediately. Not defensive, authoritative. "You have your pool pass on you?" he asked, as if it were the most natural question in the world. Ronda kept her voice calm, almost casual. "Why?" He gave a short laugh, trying to soften the edges of the question, but the undertone remained sharp. "Well, we've had some incidents lately. People sneaking in who don't belong. Can't be too careful, you know." She let that sit in the air for a moment. She didn't look away. "I live here." The man's brow lifted, like he'd caught her in some kind of lie. "Really? That's funny. I've lived here almost 6 weeks and I've never seen you before." Ronda resisted the urge to smile, to shake her head at the absurdity of it. 6 weeks. She had lived here for almost a year, and already he thought he knew who belonged. "I bought my house last year," she said simply. The man glanced around as if expecting someone to corroborate or challenge her claim. The pool area remained otherwise unchanged. Families chatting quietly, children splashing, a few older residents reading in lounge chairs. No one else seemed to notice or care about their conversation, but Ronda knew better. She could feel the way the man's voice cut through the ambient noise, how the edges of other conversations had started to soften, attention subtly shifting toward them. He looked back at her, smile gone now, replaced with something closer to skepticism. "We've had issues," he repeated. "Last month, 2 people from outside jumped the fence. You can't be too careful these days." Ronda understood exactly what he meant. She could hear it, the unspoken part of his sentence. "People like you." She took a slow breath. "I came through the gate like everyone else." "Uh-huh," he said, nodding, still not moving. "You got your fob on you? We can clear this up real quick." The muscles in her jaw tightened, though her expression remained neutral. "It's in my bag." He shifted his weight, clearly expecting her to reach for it, to comply. When she didn't, the air between them thickened. "You mind showing me?" he asked after a pause, voice soft but insistent. Ronda kept her gaze steady. "Actually, I do." That seemed to catch him off guard. His brows knitted together, confusion flashing across his face before it hardened into something else. Offense, maybe. Or worse, self-righteousness. "Look," he said, adjusting the way he stood, arms crossing tighter over his chest. "It's not personal. I just want to make sure everyone here belongs. This is a private community." Ronda felt something shift in her chest then. Not anger, not yet, but a cold clarity that she hadn't wanted to invite into her day. She'd been around too many people like him in her life not to recognize the choreography. The feigned friendliness, the insistence that they were just following the rules. The polite mask stretched over a very clear assumption. You don't belong here. She wondered how many other people he had approached that morning. How many of the older couples with books? How many of the teenagers giggling near the deep end? She suspected she already knew the answer. "I'm not going to prove myself to you," she said evenly. The man's jaw tensed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Ronda almost laughed at that, but it caught in her throat. She knew this dance. She knew how it would play out if she pushed, if she matched his energy. It wasn't about the pool fob. It never had been. "You walked over here with a decision already made," she said quietly. "It doesn't matter what I show you." He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of splashing and laughter around them had grown noticeably quieter. People were watching now, pretending not to, but listening all the same. He glanced around, suddenly aware of the eyes on him, and then back at her. "Look, we've got kids here," he said, lowering his voice, but leaning in as if sharing some important secret. "I've got a daughter. I just want to make sure the community is safe." Ronda's smile didn't reach her eyes. "From what, exactly?" His face flushed just faintly, but the stubborn set of his shoulders didn't relax. "You're making a scene." She tilted her head, the faintest edge creeping into her voice now. "I'm sitting in a chair. You walked over here." He took a step back, but it wasn't retreat. It was recalculation. His eyes flicked again toward her bag, and she could almost see the internal dialogue written across his face, whether to press further, whether to escalate. The silence stretched taut between them, and Ronda could feel the weight of it. How fragile and dangerous it had become. The man adjusted his stance one more time, squaring his shoulders like he was preparing for something. "You can make this easy," he said, tone cooling into something almost condescending. "Or I can call the HOA board and let them sort it out." Ronda took a slow breath, letting it fill her lungs before she exhaled. Her gaze didn't waver. "Do what you need to do." For a beat, he seemed unsure of his next move. Then, with a stiff nod, he turned and walked away, pulling a phone from his pocket, thumb moving quickly across the screen. Ronda sat back in her chair, reaching for her water bottle with a hand that remained steady despite the storm brewing around her. She took a sip, letting the coolness settle her, even as the hum of whispers grew louder around the pool deck. It wasn't over. She knew that. It was never just a question. It was never just a rule. It was about how people decided who belonged and who didn't. And she could feel, like an itch under her skin, that this was only the beginning. The murmur of conversation around the pool had shifted imperceptibly at first, like a change in the current beneath still water. Ronda felt it in the way voices hushed when she glanced in their direction, in the way eyes darted toward her and then quickly away when they realized she'd noticed. It wasn't the attention of recognition. No one had shouted her name, asked for a photo, or tried to recount her fight record. It was something quieter, more insidious. It was curiosity tinged with suspicion, the kind of gaze that lingered too long, waiting for something to confirm whatever story had already been written in their minds. She remained still in her chair, her legs stretched out before her, sunglasses shielding her eyes from the relentless California sun. Her body language betrayed nothing of the coil of tension winding inside her, tight and cold, the way it always did when she recognized the beginning of a confrontation she hadn't asked for. She had learned a long time ago that people expected fighters to explode, to strike first, to meet every provocation with fists and fury. That was the caricature they wanted to see, the wild thing, the untamed threat. But Ronda had also learned how to weaponize stillness, how to turn patience into a blade sharper than any punch. Her eyes followed the man, Jason, she thought she'd heard someone call him, pacing near the clubhouse doors, phone still in hand, his expression pinched and focused as he tapped rapidly at the screen. Even from this distance, she could read the stiffness in his shoulders, the set of his jaw. He wasn't finished with her. She recognized that posture, the aggrieved righteousness of someone who couldn't stand being challenged, who couldn't tolerate the idea that they might be wrong. He wanted to win. Ronda let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening momentarily around her water bottle before she forced them to relax. She wasn't here to fight. She hadn't come to this pool to prove anything to anyone. And yet, the quiet morning she'd carved out for herself was already gone, drowned beneath the weight of one man's assumptions and the brittle fragility of his ego. A few chairs over, a young mother dabbed sunscreen on the nose of a squirming toddler, her movements distracted, her eyes flickering toward Ronda every few seconds. By the deep end, a pair of teenage girls lounged on towels, one of them holding her phone flat on her lap, the screen dark but angled just so. Ronda knew exactly what they were doing. She had seen this too many times, the way moments like this became fodder for neighborhood chat groups, for whispered conversations and poorly hidden glances at grocery stores. She could already imagine how it would be framed. An incident at the pool, a disturbance, a woman who wouldn't comply. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Jason finished whatever message he was composing and turned back toward her, his expression carefully neutral now, but his pace too purposeful to be casual. Ronda didn't move as he approached, didn't shift or straighten. She met his gaze evenly, waiting. He stopped a few feet from her chair, hands on his hips. The faintest sheen of sweat had appeared at his hairline, though whether from the heat or frustration she couldn't say. "I've let the HOA board know," he announced, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "They'll sort this out." Ronda didn't respond immediately. She could feel the eyes on them, the tension simmering beneath the surface of every small, polite conversation still happening around the pool. The weight of collective attention pressing in on her, expectant. "Good," she said finally, voice even. "Maybe they can explain why you felt the need to come over here." Jason's mouth tightened at that, but he kept his posture measured. "It's not personal," he repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it true. "We have rules. You should understand that." Ronda took another slow breath, fighting the familiar tug of something hot and sharp rising in her throat. The urge to stand, to tell him exactly how little she needed his rules, how tired she was of being the object of other people's projections. But she knew how that would look. She knew how easily the narrative could turn. "You don't know me," she said quietly, the words deliberate. "And you didn't come over here to get to know me." Jason's jaw flexed. "I came over here because you looked out of place." There it was. Plain, unapologetic. He didn't even realize what he was admitting. Rhonda's shoulders dropped slightly, a tension she hadn't noticed releasing. She had spent most of her adult life being told she didn't fit. Too aggressive, too masculine, too loud, too much. It never ceased to amaze her how many different ways people could say the same thing without ever using the words. He wasn't going to stop. She could see it now, the way he stood, rooted and expectant, as if waiting for her to fold, to apologize, to make herself small enough to fit into whatever version of this community he had constructed in his head. She wouldn't give him that. Jason shifted, clearing his throat. "Look, this can all be simple. Just show me your pass, that's all. We can be done." Rhonda shook her head once, slow and firm. "It's not about the pass." He exhaled sharply, frustration finally leaking through his carefully controlled expression. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be." Rhonda's smile didn't touch her eyes. "No, you are." The silence between them stretched taut, electric. Around them the pool had grown quieter, conversations dying off as people strained to listen without appearing to. A toddler's giggle echoed off the concrete, sharp and incongruous in the charged air. Jason's eyes narrowed slightly, and Rhonda recognized the flicker there. Something brittle, something desperate. She'd seen that look in opponents before, right before they lunged. She barely registered the moment his hand reached toward her, fingers brushing her arm in what might have passed for a guiding gesture if it hadn't been so forceful, so entitled. The touch was light, but it crossed a line as clear and sharp as a blade. She reacted without thinking. Her hand closed around his wrist, firm but controlled, and in one smooth, practiced motion, she shifted her weight, pivoting off her chair. Jason barely had time to register what was happening before he found himself off balance, his arm twisted behind his back, his chest pressed against the edge of the lounge chair. Gasps rippled through the pool area, the sharp intake of breath unmistakable. Someone's phone clattered to the ground. Water splashed as a child scrambled out of the shallow end to get a better look. Rhonda's voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, cutting clean through the noise. "You don't get to put your hands on me." Jason struggled, but she held him effortlessly, her grip precise. She could feel the rapid pulse beneath his skin, the shallow hitch of his breath. The entire moment had lasted no more than 3 seconds, but the air around them felt heavy now, charged with something undeniable. Slowly, deliberately, Rhonda released him, stepping back. Jason staggered upright, face flushed red, one hand rubbing at his wrist as he looked around wildly, realizing for the first time how many people were watching. Rhonda didn't move, her expression calm, unbothered. She didn't need to say anything. The scene spoke for itself. The silence hung thick for another long beat before Jason finally found his voice, brittle and shaking at the edges. "This isn't over," he muttered, turning sharply and stalking back toward the clubhouse. Rhonda let out a slow breath, her muscles relaxing fractionally as she watched him retreat. It wasn't over. She knew that. But something fundamental had shifted. The people who had been watching, the young mother, the teenagers, the lifeguard standing now at full attention in his chair, were no longer pretending not to see. The undercurrent of suspicion and doubt had turned into something else entirely. Rhonda sat back down, reaching again for her water bottle, her hand steady. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't thrown a punch. She hadn't needed to. and as she settled back into her chair, letting the sun warm her skin once more, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. The next move wasn't hers. It never had been. The air around the pool had not settled. Even as Jason disappeared behind the clubhouse doors, shoulders squared and movements sharp with indignation, the tension he had stirred remained, thick and clinging like humidity beneath the California sun. Conversations had resumed in careful fragments, but the undercurrent of unease hummed beneath every word, every glance. Ronda could feel it pressing against her skin, the eyes that lingered too long before darting away, the way the young mother now kept her toddler closer, as if the very air had shifted in density and meaning. She leaned back in her chair, her posture deceptively relaxed, though her body remained alert beneath the loose folds of her tank top and shorts. Years of training had taught her the art of conserving energy, of waiting without appearing to wait. She knew that the next move would not be hers, that Jason was not the kind of man to leave the field after losing face so publicly. His type never did. He would regroup, recalibrate, and return, this time armed with something more than polite suspicion. Across the pool deck, the teenage girls who had been half watching the scene earlier were now fully invested. Their phones no longer idly resting in their laps, but positioned deliberately, screens dark, cameras likely rolling. They whispered to each other behind cupped hands, glancing back toward the clubhouse like they were waiting for the second act of a show they hadn't known they wanted to see. Near the shallow end, the lifeguard had abandoned his earbuds entirely, his elbows resting on his knees, gaze fixed openly on Ronda's chair. It would have been almost comical if it hadn't been so familiar. Ronda kept her expression neutral, sipping from her water bottle as if nothing had happened. She knew better than to look around, to acknowledge the spectacle. That would only feed it. Instead, she let her eyes drift toward the water, watching the way sunlight fractured across the surface, sharp and fragmented, beautiful in its disarray. The clubhouse door opened again. Jason reappeared, but he wasn't alone. Behind him walked two men, both in matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo, their faces set in polite neutrality. One was older, heavyset with silver hair cropped short, and an expression that hovered somewhere between discomfort and determination. The other was younger, dark-haired, clipboard in hand, his eyes flicking nervously between Jason and the pool deck, as if already regretting being pulled into this mess. They moved together toward Ronda, Jason half a step ahead, his posture radiating the controlled triumph of a man who believed he now held the upper hand. Ronda remained seated, sunglasses still shielding her gaze, water bottle resting lightly in her hand. She watched them approach without shifting, the familiar weight settling in her chest like a stone. It wasn't the confrontation itself that exhausted her. It was the inevitability of it, the relentless predictability of people who thought power meant the right to demand answers from strangers. The older man stopped a few feet from her chair, clearing his throat with practiced authority. "Good morning," he began, voice carrying enough volume to ensure nearby ears could hear. "I'm Greg Sanders, head of the Homeowners Association for this community. My colleague here is Mark Ellis." Ronda nodded once, offering no smile. "We've had a report of a possible unauthorized individual using the pool facilities," Greg continued, his tone carefully professional. "Would you mind confirming your residence, ma'am?" Ronda let a breath out slowly through her nose, setting her water bottle down with deliberate calm. She lifted her sunglasses, meeting Greg's gaze evenly. "I live at 137 Canyon View," she said. "My name is Ronda Rousey." Mark's eyes flicked toward Jason, who stood a few steps back now, arms crossed and jaw tight. Greg's expression remained unreadable. "Do you have identification or a key fob?" he asked after a pause. Rhonda's lips parted in something that might have been a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course," she said, "but before I show you, I'd like to understand something." Greg blinked, surprised by her calmness. "Why is it," Rhonda continued, her voice soft but unwavering, "that no one has approached anyone else here today? No one asked the family over there with their cooler. No one asked the couple reading their books, just me." Greg shifted slightly, discomfort flickering across his features. Mark glanced down at his clipboard, pretending to check something that wasn't there. Jason spoke then, voice sharp. "You were the only unfamiliar face." Rhonda let her gaze slide to him, her smile fading. "Unfamiliar to you," she said quietly. Greg cleared his throat again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "This isn't about anything personal," he said, the phrase rehearsed and empty. "We just need to verify residency, for the safety of the community." Rhonda nodded slowly, reaching into her bag without hurry. She retrieved her wallet, flipping it open to reveal not only her driver's license with her address clearly printed, but also the small black key fob clipped beside it. She held it out without standing, letting them see. Greg took a step forward, glancing at the items before nodding. "Thank you," he said stiffly. Jason's face had gone a shade paler, but he said nothing. Rhonda returned the items to her bag, settling back into her chair. "If there's nothing else," she said, her tone polite enough to sting. Greg hesitated, then shook his head. "No, ma'am. Sorry for the inconvenience." They turned to leave, Mark glancing back once over his shoulder with something that might have been an apology written in his eyes. Jason lingered a moment longer, his mouth pressed into a thin line before following them. Rhonda remained still, her sunglasses lowered once more, her pulse steady beneath her skin. The moment passed, but the weight of it lingered, a bruise invisible but no less painful. The pool slowly returned to its rhythm. The lifeguard put his earbuds back in. The mother resumed her sunscreen routine. The teenagers kept their phones trained on her a little longer before returning to their whispered commentary. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, like a fault line quietly fracturing. Rhonda knew this wasn't over. She knew people like Jason didn't retreat quietly. She knew the next time he approached, it wouldn't be with words. She had felt it in his gaze, in the brittle tension of his posture, in the way he walked away like a man humiliated but not defeated. It was only a matter of time. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down against her skin, but Rhonda remained seated, unmoved, her eyes fixed on the glint in water. She waited. The next move would not be hers, and when it came, she would be ready. It didn't take long. Less than 10 minutes passed before she heard his footsteps again. Quicker this time, heavier. She knew before she looked that it would be him. Jason stopped beside her chair without preamble, his face flushed with something uglier now, anger sharpened by embarrassment, authority frayed by the knowledge that he had lost control of the narrative. "You think you're better than everyone?" he snapped, voice low but edged with venom. Rhonda turned her head slowly, deliberately. She didn't rise. She didn't flinch. "I think I have the right to sit by a pool in my own neighborhood without being harassed," she said evenly. His mouth twisted. "You made this into something it didn't need to be." Rhonda's smile returned then, cold and small. "No, you did." He took a step closer, too close, crowding her space. And then, predictably, inevitably, he reached. His hand closed around her arm, fingers digging into her skin with the clear intent of removing her, of forcing compliance the way his words had failed to. That was the moment the line snapped. Ronda moved before she thought, not with violence but with precision, every muscle, every instinct trained to respond to a threat. Her hand closed over his wrist, twisting sharply as she rose fluidly from her chair. In the same motion, she stepped into him, pivoted, and shifted her weight, sending him off balance. It was over in seconds. Jason landed hard against the concrete, breath knocked from his lungs, her knee pressed lightly but firmly into his back, one arm pinned behind him. Gasps echoed across the pool deck. No one was pretending not to watch now. Ronda spoke without raising her voice, her breath steady. "You don't get to touch me." Jason struggled, but her grip didn't waver. "You don't get to decide who belongs." The pool was silent except for the rhythmic slosh of water lapping against the sides. Slowly, Ronda eased off, stepping back as Jason scrambled to his feet, humiliated and red-faced, his gaze darting around the gathering crowd. He opened his mouth, no doubt ready to paint himself as the victim, but whatever he had planned to say withered beneath the weight of the eyes watching him, judging him. Ronda didn't speak again. She didn't need to. The message had been delivered, and for the first time all morning, the silence felt like hers. The air in the pool area never quite returned to normal after Jason stumbled away, red-faced and humiliated, the imprint of Ronda's hand still fresh on his wrist, though no visible marks remained. It wasn't bruises he carried, but something heavier, something intangible that lingered in the space he left behind. The spectators, those who had been pretending not to listen, not to watch, slowly resumed their conversations, but the energy had shifted. It vibrated beneath every glance, every hushed exchange, like the aftershock of a tremor. Ronda remained seated, her posture loose, but her eyes were distant, focused on nothing in particular. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her temples, not the adrenaline surge she'd been conditioned to expect after a physical altercation, but something colder, deeper, a weariness that had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with the dance she'd been forced to perform yet again. Across the pool, the teenage girls had abandoned all pretense of subtlety. Their phones were out now, screens glowing, thumbs flying. Whether they were texting friends, recording videos, or drafting posts for the neighborhood's group chat, Ronda couldn't say. She didn't care. The narrative had already escaped her hands the moment Jason crossed the line, and she had no interest in chasing it. The lifeguard, who hadn't moved from his perch, stood now with one foot resting on the lower rail of his stand, arms crossed, gaze fixed openly on her. His expression was unreadable, but Ronda could see the calculation in his eyes, the internal tug-of-war between what he'd witnessed and what he was supposed to do about it. For a while, she stayed where she was, letting the sound of water and quiet conversation fill the space around her. But the peace she'd tried to find when she arrived that morning had long since evaporated, replaced by a tension that clung to her skin like humidity. Eventually, she gathered her things, moving with unhurried efficiency, not because she was retreating, but because the battle for today was finished. She knew better than anyone that the most dangerous blows were rarely thrown in the moment. They landed after. The glances, the whispers, the stories told when you weren't there to defend yourself. By the time she reached the gate and stepped back onto the quiet, manicured street, her phone was already buzzing. The first message came from the HOA board. "We've been made aware of an incident at the pool today. Please contact the office at your earliest convenience." The second was from her neighbor, Mrs. Davis, who lived 3 houses down and rarely spoke to her beyond the perfunctory wave when they crossed paths on trash collection day. Heard something happened at the pool. People are saying it was about you. If you need anything, let me know. Ronda sighed, tucking the phone back into her pocket without replying. The story had already grown legs. She walked home slowly, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the quiet, tree-lined streets deceptively peaceful after the spectacle she'd left behind. Sprinklers whirred gently over freshly cut lawns, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked lazily at nothing. When she reached her front door, she paused for a long moment, her fingers resting on the key in the lock. The house inside was cool and quiet, sunlight spilling through the tall windows onto polished hardwood floors. It should have felt like a sanctuary, but as she closed the door behind her and set her bag on the table, she couldn't shake the feeling that the confrontation had followed her inside, woven itself into the corners of her home like dust. Her phone buzzed again. Another neighbor. Another message. I saw what happened. I'm sorry. You handled yourself well. Ronda rubbed a hand over her face, exhaling slowly. The apologies were well-meaning, but they felt like little more than bandages over a wound that shouldn't have existed in the first place. She moved through the house on autopilot, pouring herself a glass of water, pacing to the window that overlooked her small backyard. The hedges were neatly trimmed, the patio furniture untouched since she'd moved in, a hammock stretched between 2 slender trees, empty. She stood there for a long while, the glass sweating in her hand, her thoughts circling like vultures. It wasn't Jason's hostility that stayed with her. It was the fact that no one had stepped in, not when he questioned her, not when he grabbed her arm. They had watched, some of them recording, some whispering, but no one had spoken. And now, after the fact, they wanted to apologize, to assure her she had handled herself well. The truth was, she hadn't wanted to handle anything at all. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the shadows stretched long across her lawn, she sat at her kitchen island, scrolling through her phone despite herself. The neighborhood group chat was ablaze, thread after thread dissecting the incident at the pool. Some messages were supportive. That woman lives here. I've seen her jogging every morning. She didn't deserve that. Others were defensive. Jason was just looking out for the community. He didn't mean any harm. And, inevitably, there were those who danced around the real issue. Maybe, if she'd just shown her pass right away, it wouldn't have escalated. Ronda set the phone down with a soft thud, her stomach tight. That was always how it went. The burden of proof was never on the one making the accusation. It fell to the person who had done nothing wrong, who had simply existed in a space someone else decided wasn't theirs. A soft knock at her door broke the spiral of her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Davis standing on her porch, a casserole dish wrapped in foil balanced carefully in her hands. I wasn't sure if you'd eaten, Mrs. Davis said, her voice gentle but awkward. It's just potatoes and cheese. Ronda blinked, surprised, then managed a smile. Thank you. Mrs. Davis hesitated, shifting her weight. I just wanted to say, I saw how you handled yourself. I think a lot of people did. Ronda nodded once, unsure what to say, and the woman seemed to sense that, retreating with a small, apologetic wave. When she returned to the kitchen, she set the casserole on the counter untouched, her appetite gone. The next morning, she rose early, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, lacing up her sneakers and stepping out into the cool pre-dawn air. The neighborhood was still, the hush of early morning broken only by the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of palm fronds overhead. Her usual route took her past the clubhouse and pool, and she almost skipped it, almost turned left instead of right. But something made her keep walking, her pace steady, each footfall measured. When she passed the bulletin board outside the clubhouse, she stopped. A new flyer had been taped to the glass, the paper crisp and bright beneath the overhead light. "Know your neighbors," it read in bold letters. Beneath the heading was a collage of photos from last year's holiday mixer, candid shots of families and residents, smiles and handshakes frozen in time. In one of them, almost dead center, Ronda stood shaking hands with the local councilman, her signature smile wide, her hair pulled back, her bureau ID badge clipped visibly to her blazer. Someone had circled her picture in blue ink and scrawled beneath it, "Maybe read the newsletter next time." Ronda stared at the flyer for a long moment, a laugh curling at the edge of her lips despite herself. It wasn't justice. It wasn't even vindication. But it was something. As she turned away and resumed her run, the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. She knew better than to think the incident was over. The conversations would continue, the narratives would shift and change in ways she couldn't control. But something had cracked open, small but undeniable. And sometimes that was enough. The morning unfolded with a stillness that felt both familiar and newly sharpened. The neighborhood, with its meticulously edged lawns and carefully spaced maple trees, woke slowly under the gray wash of early light. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically in front yards, the distant grind of a garbage truck echoed down the cul-de-sac, and the occasional jogger passed by, head bent, earbuds tucked in, lost in routine. Ronda stood at her front window, sipping coffee, her gaze drifting past the neatly trimmed hedges to the quiet street beyond. The faint print of yesterday lingered in the air, not in any visible way, but in the energy that seemed to hang heavier than usual over the neighborhood. It hadn't vanished overnight, the incident at the pool. Stories like that rarely disappeared. They settled into the cracks of a place, shaping the way people moved, the way they spoke, or didn't. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with a notification from the neighborhood app. Another thread, more comments. She ignored it. There was nothing there she hadn't read before. Outside, the day stretched ahead, deceptively ordinary. She finished her coffee, tying her shoes with slow, deliberate movements. Sundays had always belonged to her feet, to the quiet rhythm of movement, the predictable cadence of her breath, the way her body eased into the repetition of each step. It was the only ritual that had remained untouched over the years, immune to the noise that followed her name wherever she went. When she stepped outside, the early air was cool against her skin, tinged with the faint, earthy smell of watered lawns and damp pavement. The hush of the morning was punctuated only by birds rustling in the branches overhead, the occasional soft hiss of tires on asphalt. Her route took her past the clubhouse again, past the pool gate that still stood closed, the chain lock clicking faintly against the iron bars in the breeze. She glanced toward the bulletin board without meaning to, her eyes skimming the familiar flyer. The blue ink circled her photo like a quiet reminder. Maybe read the newsletter next time. She almost smiled, the corner of her mouth twitching despite herself, before she turned away and continued down the street. By the time she returned home, the sun had climbed higher, the light warming the pavement, casting long shadows across the trimmed lawns. She showered without urgency, her body loose and warm from the run, the tension that had gripped her shoulders for days slowly unraveling. It wasn't over, she knew. Not really, but the sharp edges of it had dulled, softened by the small, persistent hum of something she hadn't expected. Recognition. That afternoon, as she knelt by her front garden, pulling weeds from between the hedges, she heard footsteps approach. She glanced up to see a teenage girl jogging down the street, her pace slowing as she neared. The girl was maybe 17, tall and lean, dressed in high school track gear, earbuds dangling around her neck. She hesitated at the edge of Ronda's lawn, shifting her weight awkwardly before speaking. "You're the lady from the pool, right?" she asked, voice breathless but curious. Ronda sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her shorts. "I guess I am." The girl nodded, ponytail bouncing slightly. "That was pretty cool, what you did." Ronda gave a soft huff of a laugh, shaking her head. "It shouldn't have to be." The girl lingered a moment longer, then offered a small, awkward smile before jogging away. Ronda watched her retreating figure until she disappeared around the corner, the weight of the exchange settling somewhere beneath her ribs. The knock came later that evening, soft but insistent. When she opened the door, she found Mr. Franklin from across the street standing there, a casserole dish in his hands, the foil stretched taut across the top. "I swear, it's nothing fancy," he said, offering a sheepish grin. "Just potatoes and cheese. My wife's from New Jersey. No southern spice." Ronda blinked, caught off guard by the gesture, before stepping back to let him in. They sat on her porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. The breeze was cool now, tugging gently at the hem of her shirt, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass. For a while, they talked about nothing. The weather, the neighborhood, the ridiculous HOA rules about hedge trimming. It wasn't until the light had faded almost completely that Mr. Franklin cleared his throat, glancing down at the dish in his lap. "You know," he said quietly, "we all saw what happened at the pool." Ronda didn't reply, letting the silence stretch between them. He glanced up, his eyes meeting hers. "Not everyone said something, but we were listening." She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, before turning her gaze back to the street. The next morning, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Garbage trucks lumbered down the street, sprinklers clicked on at dawn, dogs barked at joggers passing by. The incident at the pool had faded from conversation, replaced by the mundane concerns of suburban life. Trash schedules, neighborhood watch meetings, the upcoming block party. But the echoes of that day lingered in quieter ways. Neighbors who had once looked past her now offered nods of acknowledgement, brief waves, awkward but genuine attempts at recognition. The tension that had once thrummed beneath the surface had shifted, not entirely gone, but no longer sharp, no longer cutting. When she dressed for work that Monday morning, Ronda moved with the same efficiency she always had, slacks pressed, blouse buttoned, badge clipped discreetly to her belt. But as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing invisible creases from her collar, something in her reflection felt steadier. Her phone buzzed again, a new email lighting up the screen. It was from the local FBI community liaison. "Heard about the incident at the pool. If you're willing, we'd love to have you speak at the Civic Leadership Workshop next month. These kids need to hear from someone like you." Ronda stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the screen. She hadn't asked for any of this, hadn't wanted it. But maybe it wasn't about her. Maybe it was about the girl who had stopped in her front yard, the lifeguard who had hesitated, earbuds pulled out, the neighbors who hadn't spoken but had listened. She tapped out a short reply. Happy to join. Later that afternoon, she stopped by the corner cafe on Main Street, the kind of place that sold decent coffee and knew her by name. Jonah, the lanky barista who worked most afternoons, greeted her with a grin as she stepped up to the counter. Chief Rousey, he joked, sliding her usual order across the counter. You're trending in the Windermere group chat? Ronda raised an eyebrow, taking the cup from his hand. Oh? She said, her voice neutral. Jonah chuckled, leaning one elbow on the counter. Apparently, some guy at the pool got educated real fast. People are still talking about it. She shook her head, a wry smile pulling at her lips despite herself. Didn't do anything special. He handed her a sleeve for her cup, his voice quieter now. That's exactly why it stuck with people. On her way out, she checked her phone again, another message waiting in her inbox. No name, no subject, just a single sentence. I was at the pool that day. I saw how you handled yourself. My daughter did too. I think she learned more in those 10 minutes than she has all year in school. Thank you for showing us the difference between authority and grace. Ronda reread the message twice before tucking her phone back into her pocket. That afternoon, as she sat at her kitchen island sorting through paperwork, another knock sounded at her door. This time it was Mateo, the 9-year-old who lived next door, a rolled-up garden hose clutched awkwardly in his arms. Hi, Miss Ronda, he said, eyes wide. Is it true you arrested that man at the pool? Ronda chuckled, shaking her head. No, honey, I didn't arrest anyone. He frowned, puzzled. But my mom said he got really scared when he found out you're the boss of the police. She crouched down, meeting his gaze. He wasn't scared, just surprised. Mateo nodded slowly, considering that. Like when someone looks mean but they're just tired? Ronda smiled, ruffling his hair. Exactly. As he ran back across the lawn, the hose trailing behind him, Ronda stood in the doorway for a long while, the late afternoon sun slanting across the street. She thought not just of that day at the pool, but of the 1,000 other days like it. The comments shrugged off, the glances ignored, the silent calculus of who belonged and who didn't. She hadn't set out to change Jason Miller. That had never been the point. But maybe, just maybe, someone else at that pool, someone younger, someone watching, would think twice the next time they saw someone being cornered for simply existing where they belonged. In the end, it hadn't been her badge that shifted the moment. It wasn't authority or force. It was the refusal to shrink. The quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime learning how to stand. And when people asked later what had happened that day at the pool, no one had to say much. They just nodded and said, "She handled it." Because some lessons didn't need to be shouted, they just needed to be seen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on the channel for more, and if this video resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it.